Hello and welcome to the Manchester is Red podcast. My name is Steven Railston. I'm your host as usual, and I'm joined by my good colleagues Samuel Luckhurst and Tyrone Marshall. We've got plenty to discuss today, although it has been the international break. Thankfully, we're coming to the end of it, and there's football on Saturday evening when Manchester United will play Sheffield United at Bramall Lane. But in today's podcast, we'll discuss the latest with Surgeon Ratcliffe, have a bit of chat about Jadon Sancho and his ongoing situation, and we'll look ahead to the game this weekend. But first of all, gents, how are we?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm pretty good, pretty chirpy. I was a bit ill early in the week on Monday. Could you tell? Was I not on form?
I couldn't, no.
Well, I felt like death warmed up anyways. And Tyrone, how are you?
I'm good, thank you, Stephen. Good. I'm enjoying hearing more stories from the ongoing football feud between the Shearer and Keane of the MEN.
Well, for a bit of context for the listeners, there was a challenge on, was it one night, was it, Samuel? Was it Tuesday night or Wednesday
It was
night?
Tuesday evening, yeah.
I've got no recollection of this challenge on, Samuel.
Yeah, it was very authentic playing five-a-side in Newton
It was
Heath.
in Newton Heath
yeah,
as well,
exactly.
And you had a good shirt on as well, Samuel. Classic vintage top, which I thought was quite nice. How much? Can I make an offer?
Is that why you kicked him?
I've had it for a while.
I wanted the shirt. I
wonder how many people are switching off amid all this.
Yeah. Look, let's get straight into it. I don't want to hear about this tittle-tattle. Ratcliffe then, Samuel. There's obviously not been much movement since Monday. We had a kind of a takeover special on Monday afternoon where we discussed his 25% offer for the club for a stake. Ten Hag, you were just at the press conference. Ten Hag was asked about Ratcliffe, and he kind of suggested that he'd been kept in the dark by the Glazers over the process. I'm not questioning Ten Hag, but do you believe he was being sincere? It wouldn't be a complete surprise for the Glazers to have a lack of communication, would it?
I've never really got the feeling with Ten Hag when we speak to him that he lies, really. I mean, you couldn't say that about Solskjaer, who did do that, and you could tell as well he'd start fumbling over his words. Ten Hag is a lot more direct, and you can well believe that Joel and Avram Glazer wouldn't be picking up the phone and saying, listen, this is the stage we're at, it's with the lawyers now, but there will be a minority stake for Minios, etc. It's quite telling of their ownership that I think when you paint that picture, it just seems unforeseeable. It's very difficult to imagine it happening, and when he said that today, I think people take him at face value, and we just wait for the official confirmation from the club, and we always get these press releases that we're signed up to. Sometimes we get advance notice, which is very, very helpful in journalism as well, with such such impactful news. But I think where you've got the stock exchange to take into account with this, I don't think that will be the case. But who knows when that press release will drop, or that communications from United. As I said, it doesn't feel like much has changed since the start of the week. I think everybody it's probably just wise now to reserve judgment as to what the plan will be until someone actually speaks about it. But it would have been ideal had this 25% minority stake been ratified and Ratcliffe comes over to Manchester and holds a press conference or speaks in a more informal setting. I don't know what Ineos's intentions will be on that. But we're still waiting. And as you said, the football's back this weekend, and I think we're all very grateful for that.
God.
Yeah, indeed.
I think what you're trying to say as well is, if I get the chance to play poker with Solskjaer, I should. Because he didn't have a very good poker face, did he?
I don't think
fare
he
very
would.
well.
I don't think he'd relish being at the poker table. No.
Tyrone, then. I mean, Samuel's just said we're not really sure when a breakthrough is going to happen. Obviously, it's the end of October now. November's just around the corner. January window, it's creeping in. Are we expecting, do you think, a breakthrough before then? Because ideally, you'd have Ratcliffe and Ineos coming in before the January window, and it would help the transfers and the kind of their business going forward, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but they shouldn't need to be signing players in January. Good football clubs don't sign players in January, so it really shouldn't matter, to be quite honest. What they need to do in January is offload players. They've got a 31-man squad, and that's 7 players probably too many. That situation will be eased when Reguilón goes back at the end of the season. There's a few players out of contract who might go, but the squad is way too big, and they do not need to be signing players in January. They shouldn't be signing players in January. Manchester United aren't going to sign anyone in January that adds any long-term value to the squad whatsoever. So I don't I don't think there's a desperate rush to get this deal done. I mean, you'd think it would be done by January, but then I thought 11 months out it would be done entirely, and it hasn't been done. So, who knows how long it takes. I don't think any of us have got much in the way of knowledge of the intricacies of the New York Stock Exchange and how long these things take to get done. But, I don't think January should necessarily be a hard deadline, because they really shouldn't need to be dipping into the market. And even if the season is still, a middling season as this is, I don't think the January market is really going to change that much.
In terms of the players who could leave the club in January, then you mentioned, you say 7 players. Off the top of your heads, is there any names that are really standing out? Because
Van der Beek,
Sancho.
Sancho.
Anthony Martial's coming to the end of his contract, and the January window is going to be the last chance to get a fee. But is anyone going to be paying it?
Well, no, they could. I mean, they could extend his contract by a year, and they've done that with other players in the past, low-level players. They did it with Fred last year. I think in regards to the whole Ineos investment, and the January has become topical because it's when the transfer window is opened, and so it's an easy line to crowbar into headlines on it. And I'm not criticising media outlets for it, because we'll have done it as well. But as Ty said, as bad as they've been, they shouldn't be on the lookout for signings. They should be on the lookout for signings next summer. But they've got 6 midfielders. One's injured at the moment, but it's not believed to be long-term with Casemiro. You look at the forward line, they've got a lot of options. Okay, they've had a defensive injury crisis, but I think you've got to look more to the medical department there and the fitness staff and the fitness coaches as to what the hell's going wrong there. Why is that happening? It's a vast squad, and I think the size of it is okay, but it will come to a point, and I think it's pretty much the same size that Mourinho had in his first season, and halfway through it, a couple of senior players realised that they're not going to get any playing time, they need to go. I think the difference with this squad is that it is more youthful. You've got Mainu in there, who is learning his trade. Ahmad, who's been injured, has come back from a loan. Mejbri has come back from a loan as well. The United squad under Mourinho was a lot more senior. And also 2 seasons ago, you had them queuing up in January to get out of the club. Lingard wanted out, Dean Henderson wanted out, Marshall got out, Van der Beek got out. I'm pretty sure I've missed off one or 2 others, but you got the sense at that time that it was, a lot of players had entered the end game at United, and it really was much for muchness whether they went in January or whether they went in the summer. And I suppose in hindsight it would have been better for them had some of those players been turfed out then, because look how corrosive that environment was. And then right at the end of the window you had the Mason Greenwood story and the allegations, and he was arrested, and Ralph Rangnick didn't hide his unhappiness, shall we say, that United didn't make an 11th hour move for a forward. So things are always subject to change, and of course last year they had to dip into the market because they needed an extra body with Ronaldo terminating his time at the club, and of course when Eriksen got injured they also needed another midfielder to come in. I thought they did well in terms of the profile of player they got in Marcel Sabitzer, so that could be the scenario where you see United go into the market, but I don't think that's the time where they should be spending 50 odd million pounds on a player, and also the
you never get value in January, do you?
Well, that's the thing, occasionally you do. I mean, Liverpool have done it in the last 2 Januaries with Cody Gakpo and Luis Diaz, and they are long-term forwards at the club, but Liverpool have got a much better track record of doing deals in January and them being successful, and probably the most successful of all was Virgil van Dijk, who came in and had a transformative effect on the club. I think people obviously talk about Casemiro coming to United and that sparking the domestic success with Premier League titles. I don't think it's a coincidence when Van Dijk came in, that's when Liverpool really started to move through the gears. Champions League final, win the Champions League, win the Premier League, won a couple of cups as well, another Champions League final. So it is possible to get that player, but do you have any faith in the current United hierarchy to identify that player? No. I mean, it would be remiss not to mention Bruno Fernandes, given that he came in January and he did have a brilliant impact in that season. He's been United's best player the last 10 years. So I suppose that alone is an argument to say, well, why wouldn't you? But it doesn't feel like, I think a lot more would have to go wrong for there to be a really compelling case for United to say, look, we need this player and that player on a permanent basis as well.
We discussed the priorities for Ratcliffe coming in earlier in the week, pardon me. But I mean, getting better at selling players has really got to be high on the agenda, doesn't it? For the new ownership, well, not the minority investment coming into the club. Because United have just been terrible at shifting deadwood. I mean, I think we all agreed this summer they made some positive progress in shifting players and they made a good start. But by the end of the window, we're thinking, oh God, it's ended just as it usually does. So that really needs to change with a fresh face coming in, doesn't it? It's something that we'd like all to see. It
does, yeah. And it is difficult. I think some of the criticism they get over selling players is unfair. They're not a selling club. There's two scenarios where Manchester United sell a player. One, they want to go to Real Madrid or Barcelona and they're world class. Think Ronaldo, for example, and then they get good money for him. The only other reason Man United are selling a player is because they're not good enough. You know, you look at Harry Maguire. They were never going to get a profit on Maguire anyway, and he's not been good enough. And Van der Beek, difficult to drum up a market for Van der Beek when he's failed at Manchester United. So a club of United size aren't going to sign him. So, it is difficult to sell players because the scenario in which you're selling players isn't usually conducive.
I guess the counterpoint would be you look at Liverpool and Chelsea selling her. It's the Saudi money, that's the thing, hasn't it? In the last few months, it's changed that.
Liverpool and Manchester City sell youngsters for a fortune because they've got this. It's almost an aura that they have. Certainly, City's and Liverpool's to agree that to a degree they've been close to a Pep Guardiola team, a Jurgen Klopp team. They must have something about them. They can sprinkle a bit of that stardust on us. United had it under Fergie. They don't have it now because they haven't got that reputation, and there's not been that many players getting close to the first team. Not that it's really mattered for City, but City's academy has got that reputation, which is almost enough to convince clubs. You look at the money Southampton have basically given to City for players who had no real first team experience. Where they've probably got to get better is in just being ruthless in getting rid of players. Van der Beek's a prime example who was offering nothing really, and I disagree. I think the squad is too big, even with the youngsters in it. I mean, I did a piece today and counted 30 first team players with Regulian. If they were all fit, you can't really plan for an injury crisis like this because it's totally unprecedented. But if they were all fit, you'd have 10 players not involved on a match day who've played for the first team this season. That doesn't feel sustainable in terms of keeping a unified dressing room. And you look at City and Liverpool, certainly City got a pretty small.
It's unique how he does that. It was like 16, 17 players that he really relies on, Pep Guardiola.
Yeah, and obviously it's a risk, but I was at a press conference the other day when he was talking about the demands on the calendar and the Club World Cup that they're in already in 2025, and it was put to him that the obvious solution is to have a bigger squad, and before the question had even been finished, he was going, no. And he was basically saying, how can I keep, if everyone's fit, how can I keep these players happy? And things like that. When it's an unhappy player, it spreads through the dressing room. That's why Sancho's been basically banned from the entire first team setup, because you don't want that kind of thing to spread and fester through a dressing room and through an environment. So, I think the squad needs trimming, but there are obvious areas in which to do it, and players who probably should have been sold already. That's probably where they need to get better. Just getting rid of those players and finding a market, even if you're making a loss on a player, just getting the best money you can for them.
Whose press conferences are more enjoyable? Guardiola as a Ten Hag, obviously Tyrone dips in both.
I don't know. There's not much.
Samuel's smiling
really.
Over Guardiola's considering his answer.
Guardiola's tends to be longer.
I saw a clip earlier that Fred Caldera put out of Guardiola from today, and I think the memory of that is still amusing.
What did he say in that?
I think he went, "Haha, you are so funny."
I saw that on Sky
and then his
Sports,
face dropped. I don't know. I have no idea what the context was, but it amused me anyway.
He's not great for the TV. He doesn't like the TV stations. I think it'd be fair to say Guardiola. So he's not great on telly. He doesn't give them a lot.
We'll leave it there anyways for part one. We'll be back in a moment for part two. Samuel, Groundhog Day. Welcome back to part two of the Manchester Red podcast, I should say first. But Groundhog Day with Jadon Sancho. Ongoing situation. It's been, I think, 8 weeks now since that Arsenal game.
Yeah.
I think it was the 3rd of September. The defeat.
I think it's 8 weeks since
Sorry,
he last.
I said September.
I think it's 8 weeks since he last played and 7 weeks since the.
Yeah. But I mean, still banished. The situation's still ongoing. Still training on his own. There's kind of no end in sight. The January window probably is that end, as we'll discuss in a second. But I mean, at the press conference again today, there was a question asked about him. Ten Hag responded, everything about him has been said. And it's just been hitting the brick wall, hasn't it, in the last few weeks in press conferences when questions have been asked about Sancho.
It is the question that you will get short shrift from Ten Hag on. He's not even referred to him by name, and he must have had probably about a dozen questions, must have fielded about, well, in fact, a dozen questions alone in that first press conference back pre-Brighton 4 or 5 weeks ago, I imagine. So he's been bombarded with questions on Sancho over the last 5 weeks. I think the last time he mentioned him by name was probably when I set the ball rolling and asked him why he wasn't in the squad at Arsenal. And he said it was down to his training form. And then, of course, everything erupted. The only resolution is to get rid of him in January, and I think we've all known that for quite some time. I was quite surprised. One, that United, like, with the squad photo story, that United put out a little clip of them doing a squad photo, because they've literally, I don't think United squad has posed for a squad photo in person for some 9 years. They always just, if they do one, and they've not bothered with one in recent years, they just Photoshop it. And so they did that, and they've put that clip out, and immediately you think, well, Sancho can't be in that. I asked the question of people at United who, unsurprisingly, didn't want to say. I managed to find out from someone who said he definitely wasn't there. So that in itself is a story, because they've not ruled out reintegration. But if you're cutting him from the school photo, I mean, I can't remember
It's been on the naughty step, hasn't he, for a long
time?
time?
Exactly. There was never a classmate I had who was cut out of our class photo or anything like that. So I think it's end of days for him at United, and there is a little more to say on it, because it's the story that there's always demand for, because there's still not been a resolution. He is still out in the cold. He is an England international as well, so there's that added interest from the press and the media in this country, of course. But he has been an irrelevance at United for 5 weeks as far as their form on the pitch is concerned. And although they've been on a bad run, I don't think any right-minded individual has been saying, well, it would have been different if Jadon Sancho was playing, because he was such a flaky performer in his first 2 seasons at the club. And the more you dig into it, and I did think it as well before they signed him, there were just some red flags with Sancho that I thought, I'm not necessarily sure this is the match made in heaven that FIFA enthusiasts.
It's mentality, because as we've talked about, I mean, he called himself a scapegoat back then as well, is that he's actually better on the opposite side, on the left side, than he was on the right. What were those red flags that really stood out?
Well, there were definitely some aspects about his character,
not everyone's suited to represent Manchester United.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, you can't. Sometimes you can't pin a name to certain things or go into details, especially on a film podcast. But you try and gather as much information on the player as possible. And I'm not saying he's the exception to the norm at United either. I think there have been other players that they've signed in recent years, whether it be for football or non-footballing reasons, that I've just not agreed with. Sometimes it's worked out, sometimes it hasn't worked out. But I mean, Solskjaer said himself in the interview he did with Andy Mitten last month, and I thought, well, what were you doing about it? When he said, we wanted Jadon for the right-hand side, but then he comes and he wants to play on the left, and Marcus Rashford plays on the left. You could have told me that before Sancho signed for United. Anyone would have known that he played a hell of a lot of football for Dortmund on the left. So what the hell were the United recruitment department doing, saying, yeah, go for him, even though the chances are he won't? Ask the question of the agent, where does he like playing?
His minutes to goal ratio on the left is so much better at this time at Dortmund than it was on the right. And that's such a freely available statistic. I know it's not everything you look at.
No, absolutely. If you're a recruitment analyst at United and you flag that, that should make people take stock of it and think, well, is this the right player that we should be going for? So to a very minor extent, he has been a victim of United's patchy recruitment and the processes and the lack of due diligence they do in it. But as I said before, when you accuse your manager of lying, you cannot play for the club again. And it was interesting, Ty's story in the week about his arrangements at Carrington, which obviously they're not great, but he's only got himself to blame for that. And I know mental health is a lot more, it's much more topical in sport as it should be, and people have to bear that in mind. But he's, as I said, he's brought this on himself, and when a player behaves like that, you can't just allow them back into the team if they're not apologising. The closest he's got to an apology was just deleting the post.
Perfect segue then, Tyrone, on to you with your story from the week, as Samuel just suggested. His friends believe he's in the wrong. I mean, we've said it on this podcast a few times, look, even if you don't believe it, you said just go into the office with your fingers crossed behind your back, apologise like a grown-up and move on.
Like a grown-up with your fingers crossed behind your back.
Just do what you got to do, Sancho. Just do what you got to
exactly.
do. But tell a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it is incredible that he's not apologised. And yeah, from what we hear, that his teammates, even the closest friends, have said that while understanding maybe an element of his frustration, he was clearly in the wrong over that post, which he must know as he's deleted it. And yeah, just told him to suck it up, go and apologise, but he won't. As we say, it's 8 weeks now. If you're being told by your teammates to go and apologise and your friends to go and apologise and you're not doing, then you've got to wonder if it's ever going to happen. And there's also the point now of, I mean, what is an apology worth 8 weeks down the line? It's just, it's crazy. It's worthless now, that apology. The moment has passed, and it is a strange one, and he is just completely, like Sam says, not on that team photo, doesn't see any of his teammates at Carrington. He gets changed in the academy building, has to lock the door in the changing room of the academy building while he's getting changed on his own because there's minors there. It's just an incredible setup, really. And yeah, I mean, it's a sad waste of a talent, really. You wonder where he goes next, and it's difficult to see. I think it's pretty clear that you're not going to listen to offers for him in January. I'd imagine they'll take the first one that comes, to be honest, because they're not in a great position to negotiate, and they need rid, don't they? But it is an astonishing waste of talent to think that they signed a £73 million England winger at, when was he, 20, I think, when he signed, and now, as I've said in the past, 10 wingers would have to be injured for him to be close to that England squad. More than that now, probably 20. But even when he was playing at the start of this season, he was probably a dozen down the list of England wingers that Southgate would consider. And it's, as I mentioned, there's clearly been issues with England as well. There's reasons why Southgate just hasn't gone near him for a long time now. I don't think he's played since the
Euros,
Euros.
Or was it the
I
squad?
think he played.
I think
he played in one of the qualifiers after that, but it's 2 years.
Yeah, since then there's been nothing, and he's miles away from it now. And yeah, it is. It is a sad waste of a talent when you think what an exciting signing it was. But I just cannot see a way back for him now.
Do you think this has had, I mean, surely it has had a little bit of impact in the dressing room the last few weeks? Because if you consider the personal relationship Sancho has, he's still got friends, he's a human. They might think he's in the wrong, Rashford, etc., whoever that is. But they're still going to talk to him, they're still going to have lines of communication, of course. His friends aren't just going to shut him off. Do you think that's affected the dressing room at all, or created a little bit of unrest behind the scenes?
No, because I think we'd have heard about it by now. And I know there have been some bit of spurious chatter. I think, was it, in fact, I don't even name the radio station that came out. There was a remarkable headline while I was off about how, the players, they didn't like the treatment of Ronaldo, they don't like the treatment of Sancho. I've heard from this man who knows this player. It was remarkable stuff, and it
And
made
you talking
the
about the
splash.
tomato face, are you?
Yeah, that would be one way of describing him. He used to play for, he very briefly played for Manchester United as well. Did Alan Brazil.
I think he's got his shout out.
But I was reading these quotes. I thought, my God, how's when I saw the headline, I thought, wow. And then you saw who the quotes were attributed to, and I realised pretty quickly it's complete nonsense. I mean, the notion that the United dressing room were appalled by how Ronaldo was treated is completely ludicrous. They were appalled by how Ronaldo behaved, and look how they performed after he went permanently. They went on this great long winning run, and
they performed like they were so disappointed.
Yeah. Well, that's it. It's if BBC's you've got that BBC verified channel now. If they were to do it on Alan Brazil's quotes, I think they would they'd have a field day. So I don't think it's like with Sancho. I mean, the other interesting thing is nobody's really seen him out and about either. And normally, perhaps in a situation like that, it was quite interesting. Confession: I was watching the Colleen Rooney Disney Plus documentary last night, but it starts with her avoiding a paparazzi in Alderley Edge. And she said about how they were on the lookout for her on the day that she put her Instagram post out. There'll have been perhaps on the lookout for Sancho just because he's in exile, and a lot of newspapers would run those pictures. But nobody's really seen anything of him. I think there's been the odd Instagram post from supporters who've gone to Carrington.
Was he in New York a couple of weeks after?
Well, he was in New York. He got a bit of stick for that, didn't he? Because he accused his manager of lying and then
jetted off to America.
Went off to New York. And look, they had their week off, and he was free to do that. Mason Mount went to New York last week because he wasn't on international duty with England. But it's a bit different when you've just accused your manager of lying, then you go off on a holiday. I think people of a certain vintage will say, "Well, knuckle down, put the hard yards in and
don't think
training."
We'd have a job if we accused our editor of lying and then whether or not jetted off on a break, would we? That's the thing.
No. And I think that's the last. I think that's the last agency photograph that's been published of him. He was at was it a fashion show or something like that? So I don't think he's necessarily. I mean, he's isolated. He is literally isolated because he's training alone. But I don't think that it's not like, I'm trying to think of a really ultra popular United player from yesterday. I mean, if Fernandes was in that situation, you would argue that would be the case. One, he's the captain. Two, I do think he does transcend the dressing room because he can speak English fluently. I think Spanish as well, a bit of French. Like, he can get on with pretty much anyone in the dressing room. And of course, there are a lot of Portuguese speakers in the squad as well. But with Sancho, he's always felt a bit on the margins, and he's not the only player. There were quite a few introverts in that squad, and also where he's not. He didn't start the season as a prominent player. He's not been a prominent player for United for a long time. That's bound to also have an impact on the, in inverted commas, loss of him to the first team squad.
You kind of touched upon it in your previous answer, Ty, but if you had to kind of assess his, coming up to 2.5 years now at the club, how would you do that? I mean, I was personally quite excited to see him come to England with some dazzle in Germany. I made the comparison with Jack Grealish that summer. He was signed for 100 million. And I actually felt like United got quite good value with Sancho. Was it 72.8 was the exact figure?
9.9, yeah.
That's close enough, I'll take that.
Good memory.
Yeah, but it did seem like good value. Represented a decent deal. His first season coincided with that train wreck of a year, so you could forgive him for that. But last season, he didn't kick on. It ended in the FA Cup final when he was pretty anonymous, wasn't he? And he just kind of summed up this time. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, dreadful's probably a good word for it. Dreadful, pointless. I mean, he contributed absolutely nothing, has he? You'd struggle to remember really a great game that he's had. Just a complete write-off, a disastrous move. Like I said, I think a lot of people were excited by it because he was young, he was exciting. He's the type of winger who, can get fans off their seats. He was a dribbler, likes to take people on, but he's never been that same player. We've just not seen what he did at Dortmund for United. We've never seen it. We've never come close to seeing it. And I asked Ten Hag about that when we were on tour in the sit down, and we were talking about Sancho, and I raised the point and said he's never looked at United the same player he is for Dortmund. And I think Ten Hag kind of raised the standard and said it's it's a different league. It's a harder league. But he said my vision was a bit grey as well, and that there has been moments where he's looked like that. But I really can't recall any of them.
He's having a pop you with wearing glasses
to
there,
be quite honest.
Wouldn't have took that.
Yeah, in 2023, unbelievable. I can't remember any games at United where he's looked like the player he did at Dortmund. I can't remember a single one. Samuel's memory for
I was just about to
particular
say,
games is
Samuel
better than
does
mine, so he
have
might reel off a couple now.
Borderline weird memory. So
Yeah.
if I had to ask you, right, what are Sancho's top 3 moments for Manchester United? Could you pull them out for that? Because I'll be impressed if you can. I'm thinking the Tottenham goal comes into my mind, but that was recently as last season.
His top moment was the goal against Liverpool last season, but that was more for the occasion and United being massively under the cosh and mutiny in the air.
You would have scored that though. We had plenty of time in the box. Liverpool's defence was a mess.
It's only one of the loudest roars there's been at Old Trafford for a goal, but the point in essence is right. Like, there was one spell of form he had under Rangnick where he did well, but the team weren't doing well, and it's forgettable unless you cover United as minutely as we do. That's always been at the back of my mind, but that is the problem. Like, in terms of truly good games, you can count them on one hand, and I'm struggling to think. I mean, even that Liverpool game when he scored, he pretty much faded afterwards, and he did that again. I think it was the following week against Leicester. He scored the winning goal, and then he just really didn't do much afterwards. And he was at the time, you looked at it, he was scoring goals, and he'd had a productive start to the season, and he didn't get in the England squad, and people were asking, raising the question, why not? He deserves it. But he overall in the matches, his performance level wasn't at it. And then when the season resumed at City, he got caned by Paul Scholes for not tracking back, and the full-backs were really exposed that day, and that was partly because he abandoned Malacia. I think he was playing on the left, and Anthony was playing on the right, and Malacia got absolutely toasted by Phil Foden that day.
Brought off at half-time, didn't he?
He did, and Sancho's season never really recovered. He was poor in the week after that. I think against Omonia Nicosia when he cocked up and he was hooked at half-time. And unfortunately, it was just a very sudden regression. And then he's away for 3 months. He comes back, does okay, but then it's underwhelming, and it ends really badly with his performance in the FA Cup final, where Ten Hag did snap at him because he was that poor, and the whole scapegoated thing. I think there's probably a way from Sancho's perspective, if he was really clever about it, I'm sure he could do an interview that would gain sympathy, because the sympathy for him at the moment is in short supply. But I suspect there's a way that he could frame it that he has been scapegoated, but he has to
pick up the phone and say, Morgan.
Well, there is that.
What are you going to say?
You wouldn't be surprised if that happened, but to use that tabloid quote, he needs to lift the lid on his time at Manchester United, and when he does, it will be fascinating, I'm sure, if he does it.
He's definitely been offered an interview on Piers Morgan.
You think so? He's been in his DMs, hasn't he?
100%.
I mean, having said all that throughout this segment, before we move on, we will say he's still only 23 years old, and it's clearly not worked out at Manchester United, but he can still have a fulfilling career elsewhere, can't he? Potentially abroad. I'm thinking maybe return back to Dortmund might reignite something. So we'll leave it there for part 2, and we'll be back in a moment for part 3. Welcome back to part 3 of the Manchester is Red podcast. Now, Tyrone Casemiro got injured for Brazil against Venezuela, and the first game of the international break for Brazil, he came off with an ankle injury. And then they played him again against Uruguay. Started him, he played the full game. Is that not just bonkers? He's now been ruled out of Sheffield United. He's obviously suspended for Copenhagen in the Champions League on Tuesday. But having said that, obviously it is still a massive blow to lose a player of Casemiro's quality, but it's not quite the blow it would have been last season when he was taken along in the key player, because he's been a bit disappointing this time around. Yeah,
we've touched on this over the last couple of weeks, really. Very underwhelming so far. I mean, the injury situation does look bizarre, but I'm not sure United are in a position to criticise given how they've managed Lisandro Martinez's injury this year. So yeah, it does look strange. His absence, like I say, is not as disastrous because, frankly, he has been really poor this season. He's been a major part of why they've been a lot worse than last season. And there is now an obvious replacement for him in the squad, arguably too. I mean, I think we're pretty clear now that Scott McTominay's best position is.
I thought you were going to say Manu,
not as a holding midfielder. But Amrabat is clearly can play that role. Maybe interprets it slightly different to Casemiro, but he is a combative holding midfielder, and I think he can slot in. And on current form, you probably won't notice that much difference. But yeah, I mean, it probably sums up the way things are going for United with injuries that it's happened. I'm sure they won't be particularly happy with Brazil over the way it's transpired. So yeah, a bit of a strange one. But like I say, it's not. You're right in saying had this happened, maybe not 12 months ago because he was still just sort of easing his way into the team. But had this happened in March last year, say in the internationals, I think there would have been major concerns because he was the linchpin of the team for a lot of last season. But that's not been the case so far this year.
In terms of the midfield for this weekend, then Samuel, I did Japan and actually I'll put your team in, so I know your midfield. It's different to mine and Tyrone's, I believe. I went with Amrabat, Mason Mount and Bruno Fernandes in mine. But whatever the midfield is, it's going to be really fascinating to see how they play without Casemiro in the team. And let's say a scenario that midfield really impresses over the next few games. And we don't know how long Casemiro is going to be out for as well. It could be... do you want to add that?
No, because it's embargoed.
Okay, excellent. But by the time you've listened to this podcast, now you definitely wouldn't have heard it actually if it's embargoed. But
I'll have to record 2 sections or something, one for pre-10:30, one for post-10:30.
But the point is, it's interesting because does he come back straight into that team? Like I said, last season he would have, but it's not a given this time around, is it? If this midfield really impresses without him.
Ty's completely right what he said, and that I think you suggested that he should have been dropped against Brentford, and you wouldn't have been the only punter out there touting that. And the last time we saw him, he was hooked at half-time. To his credit, he supportively came back out for the second half, watched it from the dugouts. There was no complaining, not heard any issues from him while he's been away on international duty. And that can always easily happen when a player goes away and they're speaking their mother tongue. They're always more open. That's just the way it works. But there haven't been any complaints from him on that, and he's not. So there shouldn't be. He's been dreadful. He's been plodding through this season, and unfortunately, the Casemiro we've seen this season, I think, is the player that a lot of us feared United would get in. Just someone who's a 30-year-old, won everything, off to the United retirement home to take a huge salary and just coast through and be more invested in playing for his country than his club. So I think in some ways it actually is more galling for United that they've got to that point now where he was so influential, having been so influential last season for them, when without him they wouldn't have qualified for the Champions League. I thought he was their player of the year in Ten Hag's first season. So the drop-off has been quite alarming, but they have got a lot of options there. I mean, McTominay, it may feel harsh not to start him at Sheffield United, but if you are to be harsh and if you also to be quite thorough as well, his impact was within 8 minutes or whatever it was, and it was the Alamo. It was just chucking whatever they could at Brentford, and it came up trumps with his 2 goals. But Mason Mount has been signed to play in central midfield. Amrabat is the specialist, so I think he's a non-negotiable. He starts even though he's not impressed really in midfield or at left back. And Mount did play in the last game on the right, but Ten Hag, I think he'll be, although he can't quite express it because of what's going on in the background, but I suspect he is absolutely delighted that Antony is available because Antony is his man. And although Casemiro isn't available for this game, Ten Hag's men are. And I suppose that's the interesting thing about Casemiro, and that I think Ty was talking about it on the podcast he did with you last week about Murta as football director, and he's not really taken ownership yet because most of the signings have been Ten Hag signings, very clearly. The one exception would be Casemiro, who Murta put the legwork in for months whilst Ten Hag wanted De Jong, and they kept Casemiro on ice on the off chance they went with him. So that reflects well on Murta, but for this weekend and certainly for the Copenhagen game, it's Ten Hag players really. Even Mainu, he's come through the United into the United first team on Ten Hag's watch, and I think the dilemma really is that with the right hand side, it's the toss of the coin. I mean, I've never really particularly taken to Anthony. I really think United made an error in signing him just because he's one-paced, he's one-dimensional, he's got one trick. But he's a Ten Hag player, so I think that there's every chance that he'll start in this game. And Mount has been signed as central midfield, and let's face it, Mount, they tried him on the right against Brentford, and he was dreadful. I was getting a bit of stick off Neil Custis pre-match because I said I actually thought he was all right against Galatasaray. But then during the game, I think two of our colleagues, I think it was Neil and it might have been Paul Hurst, I think they both, one of them turned to me and one of them might have turned to the other. And I think the question they both asked was, what does Mason Mount do? And it was one of those games where you wondered, what is he doing?
If you notice, sometimes, this happened a couple of times now, when he's been taking corners and they've just got progressively worse, and he's been taken off from the games. His
Fernandes has pulled rank.
It was within 20 minutes against Brentford that he was off them.
So Mount needs to get going at some point. That is serious investment. I'd completely understand it if Ten Hag put him in midfield because that's what he's bought him for. So if we were to do a predicted lineup, it would probably be Amrabat and Mount in midfield with Anthony on the right, Fernandes through the middle. I think we all expect Rashford to start on the left because Ten Hag has been very loyal to him, and Højlund up front. I wouldn't necessarily go that way, but we don't. It's just our views on these with these panel teams. But they'd have to play exceptionally well, I think, against Sheffield United and Copenhagen, win both games, of course, for Ten Hag to be absolutely convinced that midfield is there to stay for the derby, because I maintain it in terms of the loss that Casemiro was last season. He was also a loss in that first derby because the slow integration of Casemiro into that team, I maintain, cost them, because he was never going to start that game. He'd had one start and that was in the Europa League. They went with McTominay and Eriksen and City just rinsed them. As I suppose most would have seen coming, but they need a specialist into that game, a specialist defensive midfield that is, and they've at least got the choice now of Amrabat or Casemiro. It
would be a huge call, wouldn't it? Not to start Casemiro in the Manchester derby.
It would.
Yeah. Pardon me. So in terms of the other team selection then, Tyrone, obviously Samuel said Rashford's going to start at a banker, really, isn't it? Get your mortgage on that. We had to get a better reference in there for Samuel. But I'll throw another name in for you. Harry Maguire in defence. Was good against Brentford. Made the assist for McTominay's match-winning goal. I actually made the case from the start against Galatasaray as well, because Lindelof, he's had a bit of a drop-off, hasn't he, really, this season? He's been quite poor recently. So would you start Maguire alongside Varane for this game?
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot between Maguire and Lindelof in terms of third, fourth choice. I think we've seen already in Ten Hag reign that they are pretty interchangeable in those areas. Lindelof finished last season as third choice. Maguire was third choice before that. I would go with Maguire. I think he played well enough against Brentford. Played pretty well. Did perfectly okay on international duty. So yeah, I think he deserves to keep his place. I guess the only question is whether Ten Hag quite likes the balance. Obviously, there's no left footer available to him, but whether he thinks that Lindelof is a better option alongside Varane for playing on the left side of that defence, whether he'll see that as coming into it, I don't know. I mean, Maguire played on the left under Solskjaer and Ranjik.
I prefer him on the left. I think he's a better player on the left, actually.
Yeah, I can't say I'm not sure there's loads in it, to be honest.
Ty's just said he played there under Solskjaer and Rangnick, and then you say...
I prefer him there on the left. He's played there for England, though, hasn't he?
He does play there for England.
That's more we play.
Yeah. I think he was always a left-sided centre-back, and then I remember Rangnick played him on the right, and I think it was against Leicester when he'd been booed by England, and Rangnick played him on the right, and then said afterwards, it's easier to build up for a right footer on the right, which kind of makes perfect sense. And he actually played quite well that day.
He did, yeah.
I remember thinking, this is like... It was that easy. Ralph knew all along.
If you asked him, though, I think he'd say he prefers the left side. I think if you said
Maguire?
Yeah. I'd be surprised if he said the right side. I've always got that impression anyways.
Yeah, well, like
Could
I
be
say, he's played. I when they signed him in throughout Solskjaer's reign, I always thought of him a left-sided centre back. But he's not played there as often, and there's been a few occasions where he's been asked, where Ten Hag's been asked about him, and he often references him as being in competition with Varane, which suggests he sees him as a Varane understudy on the right. And if Varane's fit, obviously it's different because Martinez is out and you can't play Shaw there either, so you haven't got a left footer, so it's got to be one of Lindelof and Maguire, and they're both right footed, so I'm sure it's much of a muchness. But certainly on form, I think Maguire deserves to keep his place. I think it would be pretty harsh to drop him and move Lindelof back in.
We've got the Victor Lindelof circumstances to consider as well, don't we? With the attack in Brussels early in the week, it was absolutely terrible. He's not. I think Ten Hag said he came back. Was it yesterday or the day before?
He trained yesterday, but he said after the game he didn't sleep at all, as you'd understand, given how horrific that was for all the Swedes who are in Brussels, and it's just not. It's the last thing you could ever imagine happening, and it was the sensible decision taken by UEFA to call that result as a final result, because I think Lindelof conducted himself impeccably as the captain, saying that this game shouldn't be replayed. We can't qualify. Belgium have qualified. What's the sense in it? Nobody's head was in the right place. Would be in the right place for that game to be replayed, given what happened. And I think Ten Hag, actually, what he said about Lindelof today was really it was quite warm words from a manager who at times he gives off a gruff exterior, but clearly United have had a duty of care with Lindelof this week, given what he's gone through, and they've shown that with him before. He's had it almost portrays him as this very luckless person, but of course his house was broken into that time, and his wife was having to reach the safe room with the two kids, which I can't bear thinking about. And he had that episode at Norwich, which got a lot of attention, where he just had a bit of a funny spell. So
I forgot about that.
Yeah,
he's been at the club 7 years now, which is quite remarkable, isn't it, when you think about it?
He's into his 7th year
very
now.
long-serving player. About the football then, just the end of the podcast. Sheffield United probably don't have to say too much about the Blades. Struggling at the moment, rooted to the bottom of the Premier League. 22 goals conceded. Newcastle scored 8 against them. But I'm just saying, I mean, the spaces on the pitch that day were just absolutely unbelievable. They're clearly a very pro opposition. The gulf in quality between the three sides who came up and the rest of the Premier League is stark this year. So United, I said to Ty before we came on, United should be winning this comfortably. They keep having these unconvincing performances, but this is a real opportunity to comfortably win, get a few goals, get Rashford amongst the goals again, and really build some confidence, isn't it?
It is. But
it sounds very simple, doesn't it?
It sounds extremely simple. I'd say Bramall Lane's probably one of the most atmospheric grounds in the top flight, and the kick-off time will certainly amplify the atmosphere as well, where it's at 8 p.m. I think it was due to be on the Sunday, but then it was switched because of United's Champions League commitments. But going back to that behind closed doors era, I mean, there were two teams who I felt, certainly going to the games, who really lost out on having supporters present. One was Liverpool, because it seemed like every team who hadn't won at Anfield in decades won at Anfield, and the other one was Sheffield United, who got promoted in 2019, had a brilliant first season. They were brilliantly backed at Bramall Lane. Without it, they were easy to play against, and they were relegated quite early on this season. They were doomed quite early on, it felt like. But that season they still somehow beat United at Old Trafford in one of those strange results that seem to occur on a monthly, if not a weekly basis. And when United went there 4 years ago, it was a surreal game. United played well for 7 minutes, but they just happened to score 3 goals in those 7 minutes to go from 2-0 down to 3-2 up. And in the end, it finished 3-3, and you didn't quite know whether to make head or tail of that game. But although Sheffield United have changed since then, and Ten Hag cited this today, they have had 2 results this season where, although they've lost against Tottenham and City, they've lost narrowly. I mean, the City game, I think, was it an 88th minute winner for City against Tottenham? They went beyond the 90th minute 1-0 up, but Spurs got 2 goals in added time, because obviously there's a lot of stoppage time that's played these days due to accusations of time wasting, which Paul Heckingbottom, the the Sheffield United manager wasn't happy about. It's pretty remarkable he's still in a job, given that I think everybody assumes he's going to get the sack at some stage sooner or later, particularly after the 8-0 thumping they took off Newcastle. So although United, I completely agree, they should be winning this game, I will be pleasantly surprised if they do win it well and win it easily, because the occasion lends itself for Sheffield United to make a contest of it at the very minimum anyway.
Here's a stat for you. I just had to look up from a lunch piece earlier this week of mine. United only scored more than 2 goals in an away league fixture once last season.
Forest?
Manchester City. Talking about before. A league fixture.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're making this down myself there.
Yeah, they won 2-0 at Forest, but they won 3-0 there in the League Cup semi-final.
So I mean, obviously 6-3.
Scored 2 at Leeds.
More than 2.
Oh, more than 2
More than 2 once.
Got you.
Which is it's so
in the
poor.
In the game
isn't
they
it?
conceded 6 in.
Exactly, and you think the talent, the attacking talent they've got. It's dismal, the away record. Samuel, just the end, and Samuel mentioned obviously Paul Heckenbottom's continued. You speculated, Tyrone, that he might have been sacked when we won the last podcast. That probably helps United, doesn't it? Because if they had a new manager bounce, it's going to be conducive to an upset.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when the speculation seems to be that Chris Wilder
lurking in the shadows.
Is lurking, suddenly going to games and potential homecoming and returning, and I'm sure that would get the crowd going. So, Paul Heckenbottom has, he did phenomenally well to get that team promoted in pretty dire circumstances, given their financial issues. They sold their best players in the summer. They sold their best midfielder to Burnley. They sold their best striker to Marseille. They've not really adequately replaced them. They look certainties for relegation. They look pretty... I was going to say look a soft touch. I mean, the way they're playing against Newcastle, you have to say they were a soft touch, but they obviously, like Samuel referenced, they dug in well and against Tottenham and City. I think they were battered in both of those games, but they showed a lot of fight, I guess, to keep the score down. I mean, I don't think City took the lead until after the hour mark at least, and obviously Tottenham's 2 goals were after the 97th minute or something like that, I think. So, they've shown they can fight, but since that Newcastle game, they've lost pretty easily. Lost 3-1 at Fulham.
I think Fulham have been quite poor as well.
They have.
Yeah, so that should be another result that's set alarm bells ringing. I mean, not winning is just not an option for United. They have to win, and like you said, really they should win, looking reasonable doing so. But it's not. It is, as Samuel mentioned, it's a tricky kick-off time, and if the weather's like it is today, then it's going to be pretty. It's going to be a dog of a game, isn't it? So
what's the walking song that their fans chant?
Greasy Chip Bus.
Greasy Chip Bus, yeah.
Do you want to give her
fill up my senses.
I was going to say, do you want to give her a rendition?
I
don't know the rest of the
word.
Thanks for your time then, lads.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
And thank you very much to the listeners as usual. Some plugs, head across to TikTok, everyone's favourite platform. We're not just doing dance videos, there is some relevant United content over there. Twitter, etc. Head across to the website and YouTube. But we're ticking across nicely with subscribers. We'll be back on Monday to review the Sheffield United game, and then on Friday for a Manchester Derby special. So look out for that, which should be good. Have a great weekend and take care.